Have you ever witnessed a moment so small, so ordinary, yet it carried the weight of an entire nation's dignity on its shoulders? Have you ever believed that the world already made its judgment about someone, only to realize that a single act could shatter that belief into pieces? Because that is where this story begins, in a silent room, in a foreign land where decisions were made far from the people they affected, with a blueprint laid out on a polished table and a Filipino name printed on the corner. There has always been a quiet insult lingering beneath conversations in global construction circles, a whisper that many chose to ignore, but everyone somehow heard. "Filipino engineers," they would mutter. "They're good workers, but they're not the ones who design the future." It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't even blunt. It was wrapped in politeness, in soft tones, as if the world had already accepted it as truth. And the strange thing is, people nodded. People repeated it. People believed it. Even one of Dubai's most respected structural engineers, a man who had been invited to lecture at conferences from Berlin to Riyadh, repeated that very line. His name was Omar Al-Hussein, a perfectionist, a man both feared and admired for his standards. He believed that engineering was not just a science, but a form of divine order. And when he was handed a Filipino blueprint for the foundation of a new mega project, a blueprint designed by a young engineer from Quezon City, he rejected it without hesitation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone directly, but his words cut sharper than steel. "This design," he said, "could not have come from someone trained properly." A quiet sentence, a controlled tone, yet it landed like a blow. What if I told you that just months later, he would stand in front of the world and publicly admit he was wrong? Because something happened, something so unexpected, so disruptive, that it forced the construction world to re-examine what it thought it knew. And the man at the center of that disruption was the Filipino engineer behind the rejected design, Marco de la Vega, a 33-year-old who grew up watching his father repair broken electric fans for neighbors in a narrow Manila alleyway. Marco never imagined his work would reach Dubai. He never imagined he'd be flying across deserts, sitting across men with titles heavier than the buildings they designed. He simply drew what he believed was right, what his training and instinct told him. And when he learned his blueprint had been rejected, he didn't feel anger. He felt something far more piercing, a quiet, familiar ache, the kind Filipinos around the world have felt whenever their competence is doubted before they even speak. But what happened after that moment? That is where the story twists, where expectations crumble, where Marco's quiet determination meets the very heart of what it means to be Filipino. And as this journey unfolds, you may find yourself questioning things you once believed, not just about engineering, but about dignity, faith, and the surprising places where greatness is born. There is a strange kind of silence that follows rejection, the kind that wraps itself around the heart before a person even knows how to respond. For Marco de la Vega, that silence lasted longer than he expected. Not because he doubted his skill, but because deep inside he feared that familiar pattern, the world already deciding who he was before he ever got the chance to speak. But Marco's story did not begin in Dubai. It began in a cramped house in Quezon City, where rainwater slipped through the ceiling when storms arrived, and where his mother counted coins every evening, trying to make the numbers match. It began with a childhood marked by moments that most people overlook. The hum of electric fans his father repaired, the smell of solder, the quiet determination of a man who kept fixing things even when the tools in his hands were rusted and old. Marco grew up watching his parents choose dignity every single day, even when life didn't make it easy. There was an illness, too, untreated for years because hospitals were expensive, and insurance was a luxury. His father's lungs had weakened, forcing Marco to work odd jobs while studying engineering at night. He dreamed of graduating on time, yet poverty always seemed to place itself between him and the future he imagined. And when he finally earned his degree, he faced another wall. Companies abroad that welcomed Filipino workers but not Filipino ideas. He tried applying to firms in Tokyo, Boston, Frankfurt, each time sharing designs he believed could stand on their own. But the responses were painfully similar. "We appreciate your interest. We will keep your application on file." And the quiet, unspoken line beneath it all: "We already know what you are capable of." It was the kind of rejection that didn't shout, it simply dismissed. So when the opportunity in Dubai came, Marco carried every bruise, every closed door, every doubt he had swallowed for years. He hoped this time would be different. Yet here he was again, blueprint in hand, watching his design be rejected before the conversation even started. But life is rarely linear, and sometimes the smallest spark appears in the most unexpected places. Marco had been given one final chance, not by the senior engineers, not by the foreign consultants, but by a junior Filipino architect working quietly in the background. Her name was Clara, and she had seen the blueprint before it reached the table where it was dismissed. She believed in it, she believed in him, and she believed that mistakes had been made. Still, hope can be dangerous when the world has disappointed you too many times. Clara introduced Marco to someone she trusted deeply. A Filipino structural professor from Manila who was visiting Dubai for a collaboration project. A calm, soft-spoken man, known not for his fame but for the lives he had shaped. His presence was gentle, almost fatherly, and yet there was something in his eyes, a conviction sharper than steel. He didn't promise salvation. He didn't promise victory. He simply said, "Let me look at your work." And for the first time in a long while, Marco felt the faintest flicker of possibility. Not certainty, not triumph. Just a light, distant, fragile, but real enough to make him breathe again. Something was beginning to shift. The question now was whether that tiny spark could survive the weight of everything standing against him. There are moments in life when a single decision, almost insignificant at first glance, becomes the bridge to an entirely different world. For Marco, that moment arrived when the professor from Manila laid the blueprint across the table of his temporary Dubai workspace. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting soft gold across the paper. And for a second, everything felt still, as if the blueprint itself was holding its breath. The professor's fingers traced the lines with quiet care, the way one might touch something fragile yet full of potential. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't rush to judgment. And that silence, that thoughtful silence, unraveled years of Marco's guardedness. For once, someone was not evaluating him through the lens of nationality. Someone was simply looking at the work. After a long moment, the professor looked up. His voice was gentle but steady. "This design, it's unconventional. But unconventional is not wrong. It's bold, and it's brilliant." Marco felt something inside him shift, like a knot loosening after years of tension. But the professor didn't stop there. He asked questions, real questions, about stress loads, soil conditions, seismic tolerances. And Marco answered them one by one, not from pride, but from a place of deep familiarity. These were ideas he had carried alone for too long, ideas that had never been given a chance to be heard. The professor leaned back, thoughtful. "Dubai might not see it yet, but the Philippines will." A week later, through Clara's insistence and the professor's recommendation, Marco found himself on a flight back to Manila, clutching the same blueprint that had been rejected. But this time, he wasn't returning in defeat. He was returning to a place that had quietly shaped him, a place where faith and resilience didn't just live in churches or stories, but in the very way people breathed. Stepping out of Ninoy Aquino International Airport, Marco was struck by something he hadn't felt in years. The humidity embraced him like a familiar relative. The voices of strangers carried warmth instead of suspicion. And even the chaotic rush of the city felt oddly comforting, like a heartbeat he had been missing. He was welcomed at a university in Manila, not with ceremony, but with genuine curiosity. Professors, students, and engineers gathered around as he presented his design. They debated warmly, challenging ideas, but never motives. It was a place where intellect was not a privilege granted by geography. It was a place where brilliance was allowed to rise from anywhere. And somewhere between those conversations, Marco felt a subtle but undeniable shift. The skepticism that had etched itself into his skin began to soften. He found himself listening to laughter in hallways, sharing meals with people who treated him like family, walking into classrooms where young students looked at his blueprint with awe instead of doubt. He realized something profound. The Philippines did not just welcome him back. It recognized him. Here, he was not the Filipino engineer whose work was dismissed. Here, he was the Filipino engineer whose vision made sense. Something inside him began to awaken. Not confidence, but belonging. And in that belonging, a spark of courage started to grow, preparing him for a moment he never imagined the world would witness. There is a particular kind of dawn that appears only after a long night. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady and quietly certain. That was the dawn rising inside Marco. He didn't even notice it at first. It revealed itself in moments too gentle to recognize until later, like the way he began to smile without thinking when students asked him questions, or the way he lingered at the university chapel doorway, listening to a choir rehearse hymns that once lulled him to sleep as a child. Days in Manila unfolded in a rhythm that felt strangely healing. Mornings spent recalculating load paths with young engineers. Afternoons in open-air cafeterias sharing stories with people who believed in ideas more than titles. Evenings where the city, chaotic, unpredictable, alive, somehow softened the rigid edges formed by years of foreign rejection. And woven into all of this was the constant presence of kindness, the quiet Filipino kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. One evening, after a long lecture, a janitor approached Marco with a hesitant smile. "Sir," he said softly, "I heard what happened in Dubai. My brother works there too. They don't always see what Filipinos can do, but you make us proud." Then he placed a small prayer card into Marco's hand, an image of St. Joseph the worker. "For strength," he said simply. It was such a small gesture, yet it struck Marco with unexpected force. For years he had tried to endure everything alone, believing that dignity meant carrying the weight without bending. But here, dignity meant being held up by strangers, by students, by a nation that believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. As days turned into weeks, the Manila engineering community rallied around his blueprint with an energy he had never experienced. Ideas were sharpened, calculations refined. The design, once dismissed, began to evolve, not because it was flawed, but because collaboration made it stronger. It became a living thing, built not by one engineer, but by many hearts. And then came the day that would change everything. The Dubai firm, facing delays in their project, reached out again. The soil conditions had shifted unexpectedly, and none of the approved designs were holding up. The foundation needed a completely different approach, one eerily similar to the Filipino blueprint they had rejected. A video call was arranged. Marco sat in a Manila conference room, surrounded by the very people who had breathed life back into his confidence. On the screen appeared the senior engineers, and then, slowly, Omar himself. The man whose dismissal had once carved doubt into Marco's spirit now looked strangely weighted, as if he carried a realization he wasn't yet ready to speak. They asked Marco to present the design again, and this time he did not tremble. He spoke with a calm, grounded certainty shaped not by ego, but by community. Every calculation carried the voice of someone who believed in him. Every line of the blueprint echoed the prayers, the encouragement, the quiet faith that had surrounded him. When he finished, there was silence. Not the cold silence of rejection, but the stunned kind, the kind that enters when people recognize truth. Then Omar leaned forward. His voice, once sharp with skepticism, now held something almost like humility. "I have never seen this anywhere else," he said quietly. "The Philippines has given the world a solution we did not see." And as Marco sat there, the weight of those words settling into the room, he realized that his transformation was complete. He no longer felt small. He no longer felt uncertain. He felt, for the first time in his life, that he was standing exactly where he was meant to be. Not just as an engineer, but as a Filipino. There are stories that end with applause, with celebration, with loud moments meant to echo across the world. But Marco's story didn't end with noise. It ended with something quieter, something deeper, a sense of clarity, of belonging, of finally understanding where his strength truly came from. After the meeting with the Dubai engineers, word spread faster than Marco expected. The blueprint he once held timidly, the one that had been dismissed with a single cold sentence, was now being discussed in boardrooms, studied in universities, and whispered about across construction circles like a revelation that had taken everyone by surprise. Not because the design was miraculous, but because of where it came from, and from whom. Emails poured in, invitations to collaborate, messages from engineers around the world who wanted to understand how a Filipino blueprint had solved a problem that billion-dollar firms could not. And in each message, whether written formally or in hurried admiration, Marco saw something shift. A tone of respect, a sense of acknowledgement, a recognition long overdue. Yet even as opportunities expanded before him like an open horizon, Marco found himself drawn back not to the glitter of Dubai's skyline, but to the warmth of Manila. He returned to the university, not as a guest this time, but as a lecturer, a mentor, someone who had walked through fire and returned with something worth sharing. Students gathered around him not because of fame, but because they recognized in him something deeply Filipino, the quiet courage to rise after being underestimated. One afternoon, standing before a new class, Marco held the same prayer card given to him by the janitor weeks before. St. Joseph the Worker, a symbol of labor, dignity, and humility. He placed it on the table beside him, not as a charm, but as a reminder of everything he had learned. That brilliance means nothing without empathy, that ideas flourish where kindness lives, that resilience grows strongest in lands where faith is woven into the everyday lives of the people. When the Dubai project finally incorporated his design, Omar requested a personal call. His face appeared on the screen, no longer carrying the stern superiority that once defined him. Instead, there was a softness, almost a reverence. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture rare for a man of his stature. "You did not only fix a foundation," he said. "You fixed something in us, a blindness we did not realize we carried. Your country, your people, the world has underestimated them for too long." Marco didn't speak immediately. His throat tightened, not from pride, but from something more profound, the realization that this acknowledgement was never for him alone. It was for every Filipino engineer working overseas, every nurse whose competence was questioned, every teacher overlooked, every worker underappreciated. It was for his father, soldering wires in a small home. It was for the Philippines itself, a nation often seen as small by those who never understood its depth. And in that moment, something crystallized inside him. The Philippines did not just help him survive rejection. It helped him live again, with purpose, with courage, with a heart stronger than steel. He realized he did not want to leave. He wanted to stay. He wanted to build here, teach here, grow here, because the world might offer recognition, but only home offered meaning. As he stepped outside into the Manila dusk, the sky awash in gold and rose, he whispered a quiet truth to himself, a truth born from every hardship, every prayer, every moment of grace he had witnessed. In a world full of turmoil, he said, the Philippines is proof that compassion still exists. And that is the legacy he carried forward. Not the blueprint that changed a construction project in Dubai, but the message that changed hearts, that brilliance can come from anywhere, that dignity is not granted by borders, and that the Filipino spirit, humble yet unbreakable, is one of the greatest gifts the world has yet to fully understand. Some stories end neatly, tied with a bow. Others continue long after the final chapter, rippling across places and people who were never part of the beginning. Marco's story became the latter, a quiet wave that began in a cramped Manila neighborhood and somehow touched cities that had once overlooked voices like his. Months after the Dubai project was completed, the unexpected began to happen. Conferences that had never before invited Filipino engineers began reaching out. Journals that seldom published Southeast Asian work requested his insights. But Marco didn't see these as personal triumphs. He saw them as signs, gentle shifts in a world long persuaded that brilliance belonged only to the West or the wealthy or the powerful. He traveled occasionally, representing the Philippines with a humility that disarmed even the most proud institutions. But each time he stood behind a podium, sharing the logic behind his design, he spoke not of himself, but of the soil he grew from. He spoke of Filipino resilience, of classrooms without air conditioning, yet overflowing with determination, of teachers who worked 3 jobs, but still showed up with hope in their voices, of a nation that prays before it doubts and forgives, before it judges. One afternoon in Helsinki, after a presentation on structural adaptation in volatile soil environments, a Finnish engineer approached him, an older man with silver hair and a trembling voice. "Your story," he said, "reminds me of why I became an engineer in the first place. To build with purpose, not pride. The Philippines, I want to see it. I want to understand the people who think this way." It was subtle, but Marco felt it, the world turning its head, slowly, curiously toward a country it once saw only through headlines or stereotypes. Now they wanted to learn, to listen, to understand. In New York, a panel moderator asked him a question he had never been asked before. "What changed your path? Was it luck? Was it timing?" Marco smiled gently, the kind of smile shaped by years of struggle and grace. "Neither," he replied. "It was home. It was the Philippines. You can spend your whole life searching for greatness abroad, but sometimes the place that teaches you how to rise is the place you once took for granted." And as audiences around the world listened, something remarkable happened. People began to speak differently about the Philippines, not as a source of labor, but as a source of ingenuity. Not as a nation in the background, but as a wellspring of human depth. Stories of Filipino nurses calming chaotic emergency rooms, Filipino teachers shaping global leaders, Filipino workers rebuilding cities after disasters. These stories found a new light. Back in Manila, Marco continued teaching. He walked through hallways where young engineers carried dreams bigger than the buildings they hoped to design. Some stopped him, shyly asking for advice. Others simply walked past, inspired by his presence. And each time, he felt the truth settle deeper into his bones. That the real miracle was not that the world finally noticed Filipinos, but that Filipinos had kept shining even when no one watched. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Marco stood alone on the rooftop of the university. The air was warm, the city alive, the sky painted in the soft orange hues he had missed during his years abroad. He felt no need for applause, no hunger for validation, only gratitude for the land that raised him, for the people who believed in him before anyone else did, for the unbreakable spirit he now carried as his compass. He whispered a quiet promise into the wind. "Wherever I go, I will carry you with me." But the wind seemed to answer back, almost like a mother's voice returning comfort to her child. "You always have." And in that simple exchange, imagined yet deeply real, he understood the heart of his journey. The blueprint that changed the construction world was not drawn with mere lines and equations. It was drawn with faith, with resilience, with the Filipino soul. A soul the world is only just beginning to see.